On day 3, Marcus cut his hand on a salvage run and realized he had no idea what to do next. Not the deep kind. A 2-inch laceration across the palm from a piece of corrugated metal on a building he was stripping for materials. He had a first aid kit. He had antiseptic wipes. He had no idea in what order to use them, how to close the wound, or what to watch for in the hours after. By day 6, the infection had spread past his wrist. That is not a hypothetical. That is the pattern documented across every long-duration collapse event on record. People do not die from the crisis. They die from the skill gaps the crisis exposes. 5 trades, each one reachable in a single working day of applied practice, not professional competency, functional competency. The floor, not the ceiling, and the floor is the only level that matters when there is no one else to call. The distinction between professional and functional competency is the foundation of everything on this list. A licensed paramedic and a person who can close a wound and manage infection are not the same. You do not need to be the same. You need to reach the functional floor, the minimum threshold at which the outcome changes from fatal to survivable. Research on accelerated skill acquisition under high-consequence conditions shows retention rates 40 to 60% higher than standard learning environments because immediate, observable feedback replaces the need for extended repetition over time. The 5 trades on this list share 3 structural properties: low tool dependency, immediate feedback loops, and direct survival impact within the first 24 hours of application. Those 3 properties are what compress the timeline to a single day. The wound is not what kills you. The decision you make in the 4 hours immediately after it happens is what kills you. In pre-antibiotic medical literature, the primary cause of death from battlefield and labor injuries was not the initial trauma. It was infection. Specifically, infection that was preventable with correct wound management in the immediate window after injury. That window has not changed. A laceration from a piece of metal during salvage work, a puncture from a nail in a structure you are repairing, a cut from a processing blade. Any of these becomes fatal if the 4-hour window closes without action. The 1-day acquisition framework for this trade has 4 steps. Clean. The wound is irrigated with the cleanest available water, not wiped, not dabbed, flushed with directed pressure using a container with a small opening to produce focused flow. Debris is removed before closure, not after. Close. Wound edges are brought together and held. Butterfly closures are improvised from any adhesive strip material cut to a narrow center bridge. Alternatives include tightly spaced parallel strips, or in clean through-and-through lacerations, a basic interrupted stitch with any clean thread if strips cannot hold tension across the margin. Dress. The closed wound is covered with the cleanest available material and secured. The goal is barrier, not sterility. Monitor. You check the wound every 4 hours for the first 48. The signs requiring immediate intervention are heat radiating beyond the wound margin, red streaking extending outward from the site, swelling past the wound boundary, and fever above 38 degrees Celsius. Improvised antiseptics include diluted honey, diluted vinegar, and saline solution. None of them replace irrigation. The wound does not kill you. The decision you make in the next 4 hours does. A fire that works when conditions are perfect is not a skill. It is luck with extra steps. The gap most preppers have is not the ability to build a fire. It is the ability to build a fire when every condition is working against them. Rain, wind, wet ground, no ignition source. The 1-day acquisition framework for fire building under adverse conditions starts with tinder taxonomy. Not what produces flame, but what produces a sustained ember from minimal heat input. Fine dry grass, our bark shredded to near powder, dried cattail fluff, crumbled dry fungus. The tinder bundle is the rate-limiting step in every failed fire. Most fires fail because the tinder fails, not because the structure fails. Structure is second. Three geometries cover the four conditions. The log cabin structure, a grid of progressively smaller sticks building inward over the tinder, channels air upward through the fuel, and works in both dry and wet ambient conditions. The lean-to structure presents a single sheltered face to the flame and is the correct geometry in sustained wind. The star feed method, VI, 4 to 6 larger pieces radiating outward from a central coal, extends burn duration when dry fuel is scarce and must be rationed. Wet wood processing is a separate micro-skill within the trade. Rain-soaked or green wood will not ignite from tinder. You split it to expose the dry interior. And then introduce it as secondary fuel once a self-sustaining flame exists. The friction method, bow drill, with correctly paired hardwood and softwood, is the fallback when all ignition sources are absent. The one-day framework covers wood pairing, notch geometry, and the coal-to-bundle transfer sequence. It takes repetition to be reliable. It takes 1 day to be functional. A fire that works when conditions are perfect is not a skill. It is luck with extra steps. The roof fails on the 5th night. Not catastrophically. A section of covering separates from the frame, and by morning the interior is wet, the bedding is soaked, and the ambient temperature inside has dropped to match the outside. That is not a structural failure. It is a water-shedding failure. The distinction is the foundation of the one-day acquisition framework for improvised structural repair. You do not need to understand architecture. You need to understand two principles. The first is load transfer. Every structural element either carries weight downward to the ground or transfers it laterally to an element that does. Before you touch a failing structure, you assess which category each element falls into. You do not remove or alter a load-bearing element without replacing its function first. A temporary shore, a vertical pole wedged between a sagging beam and the floor, transfers load while you work around it. The second is water shedding. Water follows the path of least resistance downward and outward. A repair that closes a gap but leaves a horizontal surface above it has not solved the problem. It has moved it inward. Layered bark placed in overlapping rows from the bottom course upward sheds water identically to roofing tile. Layered fabric treated with rendered fat or clay slurry creates a functional, waterproof barrier on any angled surface. Lashing with cordage at load junction points restores stability to frame connections that have worked loose under movement and weather. The one-day framework covers structural triage, temporary shoring, and 3 waterproofing methods applicable to whatever material is available. You learn what fails first, what is cosmetic, and what produces hypothermia by morning. A shelter that keeps water out is not architecture. It is the difference between hypothermia and mourning. Of all 5 trades on this list, this is the one most preppers have the gear for and the fewest have actually done. The barrier is not physical. It is psychological. Naming it directly is the first step in the one-day acquisition framework, because a person who has not processed an animal before will hesitate at the first incision in a way that costs time the carcass does not have. The processing window for a small to medium mammal in ambient temperatures above 15 degrees Celsius is 4 hours. After that point, bacterial colonization of the muscle tissue accelerates past the threshold where reliable preservation begins. The 2-phase framework is field dressing followed by preservation. Field dressing follows a fixed sequence regardless of species. Secure the carcass. Open the body cavity along the ventral midline without perforating the organs. Remove organs in order from most to least contaminating. Intestinal tract first, stomach second, remaining viscera after. The anatomical landmarks are consistent across rabbits, squirrels, possums, and small deer. The same midline, the same cavity geometry, the same priority sequence. Hide removal follows consistent boundary lines, regardless of body size. Preservation begins immediately after field dressing and is governed by ambient temperature. Above 15 degrees. Salt curing or smoking must begin within the same day. Below 10 degrees, ambient cold extends your window temporarily. Smoking requires sustained low heat, 40 to 70 degrees Celsius maintained over 4 to 8 hours, not high heat. Full surface coverage with dry salt and a cool, dry location is the complete requirement for curing. 1 day of practice with a small animal produces functional competency in both phases. The animal does not become food by being caught. It becomes food by being processed correctly in the hours immediately after. The water that looks clear is not safe. The water that looks unsafe is not always dangerous. The difference is a protocol, not a product. On day 3 of water rationing, the temptation is to drink from the first source encountered. That decision ends more long-duration survival scenarios than dehydration itself does, because waterborne pathogens produce symptoms between 12 and 72 hours after ingestion. And by the time symptoms appear, you are already compromised and still without clean water. The 1-day acquisition framework for water source assessment and field purification operates on 4 tiers. Tier 1 is source assessment. You evaluate visually: turbidity level, surface film, color variation in the downstream flow, and by odor. Petroleum, chemical, and sulfur odors indicate contamination categories that biological purification methods cannot address. Would those sources require distillation or abandonment? Clear, odorless moving water from an elevated source is the lowest risk starting point available. Tier 2 is sedimentation. You allow collected water to stand undisturbed for 30 to 60 minutes and decant only the upper portion. This removes particulate load before treatment and significantly increases the efficacy of every method that follows. Tier 3 is thermal treatment. A full rolling boil sustained for 1 minute at elevations below 2,000 meters destroys all biological pathogens present, not 10 minutes. 1 minute of rolling boil is the documented threshold. Tier 4 is chemical treatment as a backup protocol. Granular calcium hypochlorite at 68 to 78% concentration dissolved to form a stock solution, then introduced at 1 part stock to 100 parts water, treats up to 10,000 liters per pound of granular material stored. That is not a product. That is a protocol executable only with knowledge. Knowledge is the only purification method that does not expire on a shelf. Every trade on this list shares one structural feature. Each has a functional floor reachable in a single working day and a professional ceiling that takes years. You do not need the ceiling. The collapse context does not require you to be a paramedic, a structural engineer, a trained butcher, or a water treatment specialist. It requires you to perform each function well enough that the person depending on the outcome survives the immediate window. That is a measurable threshold. It is a reachable threshold, and it is the threshold the preparedness community has consistently overlooked in favor of acquiring more gear. Every item in your storage assumes a skill underneath it. The blade assumes you know how to process what you cut. The container assumes you know how to assess what goes inside it. The shelter assumes you know how to maintain it when the first section fails. When did you last practice any of these 5 trades under actual field conditions? Not read about them, not watch a demonstration. Apply them with your hands, with the materials available, in conditions that were not controlled. That answer is the honest measurement of where your preparedness currently sits. You now have 5 frameworks. The 4-step wound management protocol that separates a survivable laceration from a fatal infection. The 4-condition fire system that produces reliable fire when rain, wind, wet wood, and absent ignition sources are all working against you simultaneously. The load transfer and water shedding principles that keep a shelter functional through the first critical weeks of occupation. The 2-phase animal processing and preservation sequence that converts a caught animal into a usable food source within the biological processing window. And the 4-tier water assessment and treatment hierarchy that produces safe water from any biological source without a single commercial product in your hand. None of these require expensive equipment. None require prior professional training or certification. Every one of them requires a single day of applied, hands-on practice before the scenario that demands them arrives. Not a day of reading, not a day of watching someone else do it. A day of doing, material in your hands, conditions uncontrolled, Outcome uncertain until the skill produces it. Schedule that day. Not next month. This week. Every documented collapse event shows the same pattern at month 3. The people still functioning had basic supplies and these skills. The supplies were gone. The skills were not.